Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Nakma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. Let me give you a quick idea of what exactly are we going to discuss on this episode. You all know that there's been a lot happening internationally. There has been a meeting of the NSAs of at the SCO platform of the SCO member countries where NSA Doval participated and raised the issue of terrorism in the presence of Pakistan. We also know the Afghan peace process is going on as the American troops withdrawal date is nearing, and Biden and the American administration is determined that the entire pullout has to take place by September 11. But while this is nearing, the date is nearing, the peace process is on, but nothing much is really coming out as the Taliban and Afghan government are holding talks in Doha. And along with that, India is pushing for a very comprehensive ceasefire in Afghanistan. We know that there has been an increase in violence in the country as these withdrawal dates are nearing. All that we'll be looking at on this episode of the Ideas Factory. If we begin with the Afghan peace process, Harsh, the Afghan peace process is on, and at the same time, while the Taliban and Afghan representatives are talking, we also know that President Ghani and Abdullah have met President Biden, and after coming out, he's also reiterated. Abdullah has reiterated that the Taliban talks should be on unless the Taliban itself decide to pull out. At the same time, Taliban has very clearly stated that they want to go back to the Islamic system. While they will take care of everything, the minorities and the women rights, they want to go back to the Islamic system. So, what really can we expect of these peace talks that are on? And China is a very active player there, and as the Americans are withdrawing from Afghanistan, China is engaging with Afghanistan and Pakistan very actively.
Yeah, Nagma, it seems at the moment too many pieces of this Afghan puzzle are in the air because clearly, the interconnections, the intra-Afghan rivalries, the regional rivalries, all of them are playing out, on a kind of a chessboard where I think the end state is not quite evident, and that is, I think, putting a lot of pressure on a number of stakeholders, and there is a sense of uncertainty about the real outcome. It seems at the moment what we have seen is the Biden administration engaging with a lot of stakeholders, and as you pointed out, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah both going to Washington, and of course I think what they were going to Washington is to make a case that, look, we also need some support as you withdraw. I think there needs to be some clarity as to what kind of support Washington will be willing to provide, post withdrawal, because that's going to be the crucial piece of the puzzle. Unless those stakeholders that have really fought against the Taliban, stood against the Taliban for so many years now, for almost 2 decades, unless they know that they will that Washington or some major power will have their back, I think what we are witnessing on the battlefield is quite a different kind of an end game. Taliban continue to encroach upon territory after territory. We know that the number of districts that they now have under control is at an all-time high. And we also know that the ability of their opponents to push back is relatively limited without external support. So we see, I think, what is happening in terms of targeting. If you look at who's being targeted, the political opponents are being targeted, the moderates are being targeted, things like women's educational facilities are being targeted. So Taliban are sending a message that this is the model of governance that perhaps they will bring to the table, and they have these red lines that need to be protected. Now, they are, of course, also sending out signals to America that, look, if America decides to change the nature of their force presence, then they would consider it as going back on American commitments, and therefore they'll be free to wage their war against American soldiers, etc., etc. So they are sending very clear signals. Unfortunately, the signals from the other side are not very clear. Because those who are saying that we want a stable, united Afghanistan, we want an Afghanistan that protects minority rights, that protects women's rights, they seem to be saying but not doing much. Because what is it that they are willing to invest in their towards these endeavors. It's not entirely clear. And I think while Mr. Biden has made all the right noises while meeting with Mr. Ghani and Abdullah, saying that, look, our forces might be leaving, but the support that America would continue to give to Afghanistan would continue. But unless there is greater specificity about those commitments, it's not entirely evident what the Afghan government in Kabul, what Afghan security forces there can do. And as you say, it's not simply an intra-Afghan question. There are so many regional players in the mix that I think the question would be that it can easily become a free-for-all, where all nations, all stakeholders will try to preserve their own little patch, in the process completely dismantling whatever Afghanistan has been able to achieve so far. And so I think two major interventions by Indians this week, Indian foreign minister and Indian national security advisor in two different platforms, made this point that the gains of the last 2 decades should not be reversed, because that's a very important point.
That there should be double peace within and around Afghanistan. It's really important to have peace. The intra-Afghan peace process has to be successful, and there has to be peace around Afghanistan, and at the same time raising the issue of terrorism at the SCO platform. But as you pointed out, Harsh, what can America actually, how can America actually support? Because when the Oval Office meeting is high on symbolism, Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah met Biden. He's promised that America is there, though they're very keen to withdraw and the completion of the withdrawal is nearing. But America will continue to provide the support. And at the same time, Afghanistan, the situation in Afghanistan is at an all-time low. The morale is low. There is a spike in violence. All that is there. So what does this assurance really mean? In reality, what can they do and what are they offering when they say that we are there for support? The troops are going out and the violence is increasing. So what kind of support?
I think at the most, what the West seems to be now favoring is that, given that Afghanistan, whoever governs Afghanistan, would need external aid in some form. And therefore, they can leverage that in terms of making changes in the behavior of certain stakeholders like the Taliban. I'm not so sure how effective that might be. But clearly, the onus at the moment is that, look, the military engagement is over, but we would certainly like to help Afghanistan stand on its own feet. So the kind of aid that we have given, we don't want to whittle it down to bare minimum. We would want to continue that aid, because ultimately that's a question of capacity building for Afghanistan, and that is something that perhaps can be leveraged in some way vis-a-vis the Taliban. That, look, if you want to govern, you will not be governing on your own. You'll be governing with other stakeholders. So you'll have to share power. B, you will have to be dependent on other stakeholders if you don't want to govern as you were governing in 1990s. So there is, I think, these 2 points are being, engaged with, are being looked at, and are being talked about when these negotiations are happening. The only issue is that while certain sections of the Taliban may be looking at this more favorably than they would have in the past, it's not entirely clear whether the Taliban as a whole gets this point. And I think that's where the problem lies. Can the West, can other stakeholders who want a moderate, stable, economically sustainable Afghanistan, can they wean different sections of Taliban? Can they differentiate between them? Can they make a case to those who want to be part of a larger power structure that at the end of the day, you have to govern in 2021 and post 2021 environment, not in the 1990s environment where you could simply kill people wantonly, where you could use your traditional law, Sharia law and Islamic law and govern ruthlessly just on the basis of guns, and you can only rely on one actor, which was Pakistan. Today, can you do that? And if you think that you can't, then you have other stakeholders that you have to take into account, and other stakeholders will also push back. So I think there is an element here to deter the worst elements in the Taliban, and to make a case to them that, look, today's governance model is different, and you have to engage with others. And if you want to do that, there are certain red lines that should be drawn. I think the challenge here is that so far what we have seen is that all the red lines are being drawn by the Taliban. that they are saying that, look, if you do this, we will do this. If you do this, we will escalate. If you do this, we will kill the moderates. And they're doing that wantonly. I think if you
Yes.
look at what is happening within Afghanistan, it's a very sad picture. Those who had supported democratic Afghanistan, they're fleeing. We have had reports this week that certain security forces crossed borders with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan because they were run over, and Taliban gained control over some of these areas in the north. And they push these security forces away into other countries. So clearly, we are looking at a very, I think, at a picture where if those who had stood up for a modern Afghanistan are feeling left out, are feeling away from the mainstream, and they think that there is no one to help them and to have their back. If that continues, then I think the momentum would shift considerably to the Talibani side.
There's a lot of apprehension within Afghanistan, like you said, all those people who are supporting a democratic Afghanistan, a lot of apprehension, and Pakistan's significance as an actor in the Afghan peace process and stabilizing Afghanistan remains high. But at the same time, Pakistan continues to be on the grey list, Harsh, of the FATF, though it has taken action against a lot of points that were mentioned in the list earlier, 26 out of 27 points, but it has failed to take action over all those UN designated terrorists. Last few months has seen conviction on terror financing charges of LET Chief Hafiz Saeed, Operation Commander Lakwi, but still Pakistan remains on the list of FATF, which actually means that there'll be no legal sanctions, but it attracts economic strictures. How does that affect Pakistan and being on the grey list that Pakistan has been wanting to come out of so desperately?
I think this continues to be a big challenge for Pakistan, partly because its economy is in such a dire straits, and it would really help Pakistan if it is removed from the grey list. But I think it is also important for the international community to keep on sending this message, because this is a very important message that is being sent. And I think, again, if you see, Indian External Affairs Minister, Indian National Security Advisor's comments on two different platforms, it was fairly evident that, both were making this point that a concerted effort is needed, insofar as terrorism is concerned. Now, if the UN has sanctioned certain key individuals, certain groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and if Masood Azhar and others are designated terror individuals, then I think for Pakistan, the space to maneuver becomes very limited. And that's the point that I think FATF was making when they did not remove Pakistan from the grey list, because the point was that at the end of the day, Pakistan has to show and reassure the international community that it is taking the international community's consensus on board. Because when UN says these are designated terror individuals or these are terrorist organizations, and you do not take action against them, then you are basically telling the world that we can unilaterally decide how to operate. And we can unilaterally decide not to sanction certain individuals or certain groups. But clearly, from FATF, the message is that there has to be a concerted effort towards fighting this, and Pakistan has to demonstrably show its commitment to this. So I think that's a welcome step as far as India is concerned.
Absolutely. And at the same time, this issue of terrorism has been raised at a different platform too by India at the meeting of NSAs, of SCO countries, where NSA Doval raised this point in the presence of the Pakistani counterpart, and the countries have agreed to come together and fight international terrorism. So the pressure to contain terrorism emanating out of Pakistan, it's actually increasing on Pakistan with the FATF, and this being raised at another platform.
Yes, I think, and that certainly is interesting. Even the issues that we were discussing earlier about Afghanistan, I think this point is also interesting in that context, because for India, the most important challenge, if Taliban with Pakistani support come to power and start demolishing the state structures in Afghanistan, the challenge would be that the terrorism that would emanate from Afghanistan would be targeted largely at India. And so I think India is making these preemptive moves now to make a case to the world that sources of terrorism will have to be dealt with. And Pakistan is the main source of terror in the region. Pakistan's foreign policy, both vis-a-vis India and Afghanistan, is premised on nurturing terror groups. It's premised on harboring these groups so that they can achieve their geopolitical ends vis-a-vis India and Afghanistan. Both are unacceptable because in a region as complicated as South Asia and as interconnected as South Asia, it becomes very difficult if you have terror groups operating wantonly around the region. If you have terror organizations, terror individuals who do not show any commitment to basic norms of interstate conduct, and I think that's a real issue that India has been raising. And I think raising it at SCO was very interesting because SCO is primarily aimed at containing extremist groups, terror groups, radical groups in the region. And I think India, in fact, made a very interesting point that all of us should come together. And if we are serious, then let's join hands and tackle this, which I think, interestingly, may have put Pakistan on a bind because it certainly would have been very difficult for Pakistan to say no on a public platform, and therefore the joint declaration at SCO talks about fighting terror together. But whether, again, the question for India is always that you can always sign these declarations and you can always join the communiques, but at the end of the day, what is the operational reality on the ground? Whether you are willing to fight it out, and as concretely, and as the FATF decision shows, that when it comes to the crunch, Pakistan is still reluctant to take on these groups and these individuals.
Absolutely. So it's interesting how India raised it at a couple of platforms, and like you said, it's preempting its moves because the consequences that will happen once the Taliban have a share in the power structure in Afghanistan, and then Pakistan's role there. Harsh, last week we promised our audience that we would be taking some of the questions. So now I think it's time to take one or two questions. We don't have too much time, but we can take a couple of questions. There is a question. I'll read out the question from Umang Singh. How China can be seen as security challenge for US with far geographic region? What could be the real intent behind this? And somewhat similar, Surya Pratap Babar has been asking the last big power transition that took place with Britain handing over the baton to USA post Second World War. Now, what kind of conflict or upheaval do you see during the next big power transition between USA and China? Does China have a viable global vision to play the big dominant power role?
Well, these are very big questions. I'll just briefly address them. I think what both these questions are pointing out is a larger trend that we have been talking about in this discussion, right? There's this idea that something is happening in the global order, and we're looking at some kind of a transition taking place. There is a palpable sense. Sometimes you don't really see you don't have the evidence, but you know that something is changing in the way world order is behaving. And evolving. And I think for a lot of the observers, the idea that America remains the big player and big kid on the block is certainly there. But China's rise and the way it is challenging some of the norms and values and institutional frameworks that are available, the way it is creating its own infrastructure, that is quite remarkable. The challenge here is that, in the past, the transition between Britain and America, for example, was between two similar political systems. Today, if you're comparing America and China, they are two very different political systems, and therefore the distrust is higher. The trust between Britain and America was quite high because both were working within the same paradigm. Both had similar global interests, and Britain recognized that it cannot sustain. The edifice was crumbling beneath its feet, and therefore it needed to shift gears and become a relatively smaller player in the international order. And so it handed over the baton, as they said, easily to America. For America and for its allies to think of China in similar terms is going to be very difficult. China is more or less seen as an authoritarian, dictatorial, communist country with a very different ideological agenda on the global stage. So therefore, both from China's side and from America's side, there is going to be great push and pull. And that is going to produce a lot of contestation in the international order. Whether or not power transition happens, we won't know. But I think even that the likelihood of this power transition is going to produce and is already producing. And I think even in India, we face it all the time. So I think every country around the globe is facing it, feeling it, and we will all face the consequences of this for the foreseeable future until such time as the real power transition actually happens and we are under the hegemony of another power or the same power, if you will.
Yes, we're already witnessing the push-pull and the contestations. So thank you so much, Harsh, for that answer and explaining it very briefly. These are big questions, like you said, so we don't have enough time to go into the details of it. But thank you very much for sending in those questions, and do keep sending us questions. We'll try to take 1 or 2 questions in each episode. So see you in the next episode. Thank you.